Welcome to America at its Best. My name is Rebecca Painter and I'll be your host for today's show. So glad you can join us today and see how your gifts to State Policy Network are making an impact all across the country. Today, we are going to talk about the 2020 elections. I don't mean the candidates, I don't even mean the policy. I mean the elections themselves. I'm sure some of you out there are longing for the good old days when things were simple, when the biggest issue with election integrity were the Bush-Gore hanging Chad debacle. But we're not there anymore. And to take us through where we are today as we face a very important election in 2020, we are going to hear from Jason Sneed, who's the Executive Director of the Honest Elections Project. Jason is going to tell us how Americans really feel about this issue. Then we'll hear from Rick Essenberg. Rick is the president of the Wisconsin Institute of Law and Liberty, and he's going to walk us through some of their litigation efforts around voting. And we'll end our conversation with Trent England. Trent is the Executive Vice President and Director of the Save Our States Project, and he's in the fight of his life right now trying to ensure that national popular vote doesn't become the new system. So let's get started and turn it over to Jason Sneed with the Honest Elections Project. Jason, welcome to the show. First, there you are. Okay. First, I've just got to ask you, how much of this is hype and how much of this is a real problem and threat facing our country right now?
Very significant problem here. We're talking about the integrity of our election process. And right now it is under siege in courts and in legislatures across the country. We're seeing a deluge of litigation that is trying to change the way that Americans actually vote in November and in future elections. And all of this is being done in an effort to reshape the voting process, we argue, for partisan and political gain. And we actually think that most Americans do not want this to be the approach for handling elections, because elections should actually be above politics and not, enmeshed and mired in the political issues of our day.
So you just mentioned most Americans. You recently conducted a poll. Who did you guys survey in this poll?
So we put a poll in the field and surveyed 1,200 registered voters nationwide. And we wanted to ask them how they're thinking about elections in light of COVID-19, because obviously the process has changed, society has been disrupted. And, we wanted to know how that's impacted the way that they conceive of elections. And what we found out is actually that despite the media narrative that we hear very often repeated, that rules and safeguards in the voting process are presented as barriers that need to be torn down, Americans across the board, including folks on the center and the center left, think of these rules as safeguards, and necessary safeguards at that. In fact, when we did our poll, 66% of American voters think that the absentee process, which includes all of the rules and verifications, are there to protect the system. And it turns out that Americans also think that voter fraud is a real problem and is actually an issue that arises in elections. When we conducted this poll, 69%, so almost 7 in 10 respondents, said that voter fraud occurs in American elections, and 64% said that if you do two of the central things that we are seeing advocated for in the universal vote by mail context, automatically mailing ballots and legalizing ballot harvesting, that this would increase fraud. So what this tells us is that Americans recognize the need for safeguards in our voting process to protect the legitimacy and credibility of our elections, because there is a real problem there, voter fraud, and we need to have rules to combat that.
So Jason, Americans definitely believe this is an issue. Help me understand, first, can you just tell everyone the core differences between absentee voting and voting by mail? And can you tell us if regular Americans intuitively understood that through your polling?
Sure. So there are some key differences between a traditional absentee voting process and a vote by mail process, like what we're seeing advocated for in legislation in Congress or called for through litigation in the courts. And the key difference is this: in a traditional election, the presumption is that you are going to vote in person. And if you don't want to, or if you can't, you have to signal that you're going to vote absentee. That's what you do when you request an absentee ballot. But in a universal vote by mail system, everyone gets a ballot, whether they ask for one or not, in the mail. The presumption is essentially flipped on its head. Instead of going to a polling place, you end up voting at home or wherever you choose to and sending it back. Now, there is a deliberate effort, I think, by activists and advocates to muddy the water in terms of the differences between these two things, because the wholesale conversion of our democratic process to a vote by mail election is really a rather extreme policy proposal, particularly when you're calling for this on the eve of a national election. And so by trying to paint universal vote by mail as just an extension of absentee voting, it makes it sound a lot more credible and a lot more realistic and accomplishable, when actually the record of what we've seen when in the state primaries, when states have tried to rush into this exact sort of system, has been generally chaotic, dysfunctional, and has disenfranchised many voters.
So Jason, on the surface, vote by mail is good because it gives tons of people access to ballots. But what it doesn't do is ensure an honest and fair election. Nothing ensures it 100% probably, but it seems like it's wrought with holes. So given the choice between the two, how did Americans respond to marrying those things together?
Well, we actually asked them in the poll, would they prefer to expand ballot access at the expense of safeguards to the system, or would they prefer safeguards to the system even at the expense of universal access to ballots and through the mail? And what they told us, and 58% of respondents actually said that they preference safeguards over the access issue. Now, this is not to suggest that they're saying that they want to disenfranchise people or prevent people from voting. What this is simply asking them is that in terms of how they conceive of elections, where do they think that the balance should be? And they clearly say that there needs to be a balance. We need to make it easy to vote and hard to cheat. We can't sacrifice one of those for the other. And that they recognize, given the very real problem of voter fraud, and more than just voter fraud, the problem of chaos in elections that casts doubt on the legitimacy of the outcome and ultimately damages the democratic process, that we need to have safeguards in place, verifications that make sure that lawful ballots are counted, that illegal or fraudulent ballots are rejected, and that the process reflects the will of the voters. And that is key in the minds of voters.
Well, that's good news. Now, Jason, you said people want to see this be a process where it's easy to vote and hard to cheat. I love that language. It makes sense, hopefully, to everyone. At the same time, this feels like a very partisan issue when you start to talk about voting. So when you're saying that the majority of people wanted that, are we talking about Republicans and Democrats that you polled?
Yes. So we did our poll. We talked to everybody, right, left, and center. And we found that Americans, by and large, across the political spectrum, still think of elections as a nonpartisan thing. Obviously, elections themselves are deeply political, but the machinery of our democracy is something that they think of as above politics, and ought to be fundamentally fair, not biased in favor of one political party or the other, and that we need to have rules and stick with those rules. And in fact, some of the most contentious rules in our political era, like voter identification requirements, enjoy broad bipartisan support. 84% of respondents in our poll backed a photo ID requirement to vote. Now think about the fact that photo identification at the polls has been labeled as voter suppression for more than a decade now, and yet 84% of Americans are saying that they support that. I think that gets to the brass tacks of this issue. We're talking about common sense, non-discriminatory policies that bring order to an otherwise potentially chaotic process, that grant legitimacy to that process, and that guard it against fraud. And most Americans, when they take the politics out of the equation, want those things in place, and they want fair and honest elections.
Jason, from your view, what was the single biggest and most useful takeaway from the polling that you guys did?
That when we're talking about this issue, getting away from the partisan nature of it is actually very helpful. Talking about this as a question of principles and preserving our democracy rather than making it an us versus them argument is very powerful in terms of the messaging. And also, I was particularly happy to see that Americans think about voting rights as more than just casting a ballot. That's often how, particularly on the political left, this issue is painted, that protecting voting rights means you get to go to a polling place, you cast a ballot, and that's where the process stops. But the American people writ large think about this as a more holistic process. They recognize that you've got to have a system in place that makes sure that lawful ballots are counted, that fraud is stopped, and that ultimately that your ballot has meaning. If you don't have that underlying election infrastructure and the rules that grant that process fairness, then your ballot has no meaning. And I was very glad to see Americans think about it in those terms.
And so, Jason, here we are. The good news, of course, is that Americans think about it in those terms. The bad news is it seems like everywhere I turn, I'm hearing that more of this corruption is happening. So can you tell us more about what the Honest Elections Project is doing to make a difference in this November election that's right around the corner?
Sure. So we are doing many things, actually. We are deeply involved in litigation. As I mentioned earlier, we are looking at a tidal wave of litigation that has already come down, trying to structurally change the election process for often nakedly partisan gain. We are participating in many lawsuits around the nation right now, resisting that effort. We've also brought a lawsuit ourselves in Michigan, working with a voter there to clean up Michigan's voter rolls. That state is not the only state that has problems keeping its voter rolls clean, and we'll talk, I know, more about that in the program here. But we're working in Michigan and we're working in other states to help get them to clean up their voter rolls. And we're also helping to change the narrative through conversations like this, talking about what's really important. And it's not those shrill partisan voices on the extremes. It's people who want to have a fair and honest election and want to have the rules that prevent this system from going off the rails. We ultimately at the end of the day, on November the 4th, even if we don't know who the president is because we're still counting ballots, we need to know that the process is transparent, is accountable, and is designed to give voters the voice, not partisan lawyers or politicians trying to rig that process for their own gain.
Jason, when you and I talked a few days ago, you mentioned that one thing you wanted to make sure happens is that we have a successful election in November. Do you think that's actually possible at this point in the game?
Well, I do think that's actually possible. One of the things that people ask me very frequently when I do media interviews, for instance, is how do we have a vote by mail election? How do we make that work? And I say that we need to stop asking, how do we make a vote by mail election work? And we need to start asking, how do we have a successful election in November? And that means that we have to start thinking about solutions that maybe don't fit our natural paradigms. A lot of people think that we just need to do vote by mail. I think that we need to give vulnerable voters the option to request an absentee ballot so that they don't have to go to a polling place if they don't want to. But we also need to have safe in-person options. And quite frankly, given the fact that many states don't have experience handling large numbers of absentee ballots, and we've seen in New York the delays that can come from trying to process these ballots, concerns about voters not receiving ballots because states don't have the capacity to produce or process them. I think that frankly, we should be telling voters, if you're healthy, it's okay to go to a polling place. We're following CDC guidelines. And just like Dr. Fauci said, if you can go to a grocery store, you can vote in person. That's going to be probably the easiest way to vote. And it's going to help to alleviate that absentee system that our vulnerable voting populace will truly need to work and work reliably. But yes, we can do this as long as we conceive of the end result being a successful election rather than an election that looks a particular way.
All right. Jason, thank you. Jason will be back on for Q&A at the end of the show. So please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and type whatever questions you'd like us to ask Jason at the end. Now we're going to hear from Rick Essenberg. Rick is the president of the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, and he is going to walk us through some litigation aspects of election integrity. Rick, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me on.
Oh, we're so glad you're here. Now, I want to start by going back to your April primary election. What stunt did your governor pull that concerns you about looking ahead into 2020?
Well, everything came at the last minute. We were in a difficult situation. When early voting began at the beginning of March and the end of February, COVID was something that most people hadn't heard much about. And the pandemic arose in the course of the election. The governor for weeks said that he lacked authority to suspend the election, that he did not want to suspend the election. Until finally, the day before in-person voting was to happen, he decided, voila, I do have the power. I will suspend the election. This being America, litigation ensued. We were part of that. And within several hours, the Wisconsin Supreme Court instructed him that he was right the first time. He didn't have the authority to suspend the election, and the voting went on the next day. Now, we learned a couple of things from this election in Wisconsin, and one was, as Jason pointed out at the end of his remarks, that it is possible to have an in-person election that is safe during the pandemic.
Mhm.
We did not have a subsequent outbreak of COVID. And remember, this was April 7th. This was at the height of the pandemic. The second thing I think relates to the frequency with which voters are going to engage in mail voting. And we can talk about that if you wish.
Well, let's talk about the mail voting. How frequently do you think your voters in Wisconsin will be engaging in that this election?
In the April 7th election, about 72% of Wisconsin voters cast their ballots absentee, most of them by mail. Comparing that to the 2016 election cycle, about 27% cast their vote absentee, and a lot of that was in-person early voting. That is, they dropped it off at the city hall. There was a shift towards mail voting. And I think that that will happen again in Wisconsin, partly because of concerns about the pandemic, but partly just simple human nature. If we've done something once before, it becomes easier for us to do it again. I believe that we're going to see this voting by mail in many, many states across the country. 34 states in the District of Columbia have, as Wisconsin has, what is essentially no excuse absentee voting. You don't have to say that you're going to be gone. You don't have to explain that you can't come to the polls. You can simply choose to vote absentee, and you can do it by mail. Now, that's okay, but if you think about it a bit, what this does is it removes the election process from the supervision of election officials. We are now sending ballots out. We are having ballots filled out. We are having ballots returned without supervision.
Mhm.
That can work, but it's important for us to keep safeguards in place in order to ensure that the election is one that is both fair and is perceived to be fair.
So Rick, I want to talk about some of those safeguards, because from the role of your organization, which we call WILL, Wisconsin Institute of Law and Liberty, WILL has done a lot in the litigative space to make sure that these guys aren't getting away with cheating. So tell us a little bit about, you've got 2 lawsuits that are pretty big ones that you guys have been fighting. Tell us about those.
Sure. One of the things that becomes very important if we're going to, it's always important, but it becomes really important if we're going to have voting by mail, is the registration rolls have to be accurate. We don't do a particularly good job of that in this country. The nonpartisan Pew Charitable Trust found that 1 in 8 voter registrations across the country are either outdated or inaccurate in some significant way. And so the Election Assistance Commission, federal law, and the law of the various states have taken steps in order to ensure that we make these registration rolls as accurate as we possibly can. One of the things in Wisconsin, election officials have an obligation, if they have reliable information that a person may have moved, there's a process that they must follow. They inform the person that they have received information that they have moved. If they have moved, this information must tell the voter, you have to re-register at your new address. If you haven't moved, if the information we've received is inaccurate, simply return the enclosed postcard and we will continue your registration as if nothing happened. If you don't do that, your registration will be deactivated. Now,
That sounds sensible.
it's sensible, and particularly in a state like Wisconsin, and I think many other states qualify as well, where it's possible for you to re-register either by mail or online in the period of time between which you receive this notice and the election. And of course, in our state, and this is a little unusual, you can register at the polls. So if you present yourself to vote and your registration has been canceled, you can re-register with proof of residence. The Wisconsin Election Commission contracts with a consortium to generate what is known as a movers report. And the movers report is done through data matching, and it identifies people who have reported an address other than the one that they are registered at to a government agency. So this is information that comes from the voter himself or the voter herself. What the Wisconsin Election Commission should do is take that information and follow the process that I just described. They announced last fall that they were not going to do this. They were going to allow people to remain on the rolls, notwithstanding the fact that they had reliable information that that person had moved. They were not going to engage in the process that I described. We filed a lawsuit seeking to compel them to follow the law. That case will be heard by the Wisconsin Supreme Court next month.
Good. Thank you. All right. And you guys have another case that has to do with ballot harvesting, I understand. Tell us about that.
Yeah, this is ballot harvesting. This is the process of having, partisan activists request, help to fill out, and return ballots on behalf of voters, right? What could go wrong, right? It is an occasion of political sin. Many states explicitly prohibit this. One state, California, permits it, and that has led to a lot of problems there. But many states like Wisconsin have a law that doesn't address it directly. And many people, including officials at the Wisconsin Election Commission and other state election commissions, take the position that, well, if it's not prohibited, it's permitted. We've tried to reverse that. We've gone to the Wisconsin Election Commission and we have said that if you interpret the law properly, it means that ballot harvesting is not permitted, that it must be the voter who requests the ballot. It must be the voter who fills it out without assistance from a third party, with a few exceptions for persons who have a disability or other limitations. That's the same way it is at the poll. And it is the voter who must then return the ballot. I mean, we've seen problems everywhere. We had a congressional election, North Carolina 9, where ballot harvesting is explicitly prohibited, but it happened anyway, and the election was invalidated. And there were all sorts of allegations of improper pressure being placed upon voters by partisans who were engaged in this process. And there were, votes that miraculously didn't make their way to election officials because the partisans who were engaged in this process came to believe that they had been cast in the wrong way. We asked the commission to make a rule declaring that ballot harvesting is not permitted in the state of Wisconsin. Our election commission is by design made up of 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans. They split on partisan lines. 3 said, we're not going to make that rule. 3 said, we'd like to. And so I can't tell you for sure that litigation will ensue this fall, but I wouldn't be shocked if that's something that we found ourselves involved in, because this is really something that the law does not provide, and the law should not permit it. And we have partisan activists interfering in this unsupervised voting process. It's just very likely that something untoward is going to happen.
Well, Rick, I think you're going to see this happening in a lot of states across the country. So please keep us posted if it does make it to the next step. We'll hear more from Rick in the Q&A section of our show in just a few minutes. Next, we're going to turn it over to Trent England. Trent is the Executive Vice President and Director of the Save Our States Project, which is also part of the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs. Trent, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
All right, Trent, first, tell us a little bit about your project. Tell us what it is and why it matters.
Absolutely. So Save Our States is something that I created in 2009 to defend the Electoral College, particularly against this National Popular Vote Interstate Compact that I'm sure we're going to talk more about. But I should say, my interest in the Electoral College goes back before it was cool, back to the 1990s when I was studying the Constitution. And I really believe this institution is a part of why we have been so successful as a nation, and a part of why our elections have, not always been secure, but have been able to become much more secure over time, to where, what we've talked about so far is really defending good practices against people who want to regress and go back to the bad ideas of, in many cases, the 19th century. So, the Electoral College helps to protect our elections. And, really it uses state lines like the watertight compartments on an ocean liner to contain these problems, whether they're in Wisconsin or California or North Carolina or anywhere else. And Save Our States is all about defending that system.
So tell us a little bit more about the system. Why is National Popular Vote bad, and why is the Electoral College so critical?
Absolutely. So national popular vote is something that a trio of left-leaning law professors came up with after Al Gore lost in 2000. So this goes back, this isn't something that popped up after 2016. This goes back to 2000. They came up with this idea. A very wealthy Nancy Pelosi donor named John Koza turned this into a campaign called National Popular Vote that is pushing for states to change their laws. Right now, states choose their presidential electors based on the way people in their own state vote. Pretty straightforward. It's almost always been done that way in some form or fashion. The National Popular Vote law says we will ignore how the people in our own state vote. Instead, we'll try to collect the vote totals from every other state and choose our presidential electors based on the national popular vote, thereby hijacking the Electoral College and forcing it to rubber stamp the popular vote result. This is very dangerous because it would weaken states' control over elections. It would shift tremendous power away from smaller states and mid-sized states into the biggest cities that already have a lot of power. And I believe it would ultimately pave way for the federal government completely taking over election administration, which I think would be a disaster.
So could you picture our founders coming together and talking about this and saying things like, well, does that mean California suddenly gets to decide who's in charge?
The interesting thing is when the founders talked about this, and they did, of course, California didn't come up, but New York came up because New York then and now, right, one of the biggest states in our country. And that's actually something that James Madison pointed out. Madison says at the convention, look, national popular vote's an attractive idea. Madison sort of flirted with this idea when the topic first came up at the convention, but ultimately he says, look, the problem is the biggest states, at the time it was New York and Virginia, would have huge power in presidential politics, and everybody else would be left out, not just in one election or two elections, but in every presidential election. And so Madison, at that point in the convention, really pivots their conversation toward creating some kind of a decentralized system that ultimately becomes the Electoral College.
So Lamont Copeland submitted a question before the show, and it's a good one, so I want to ask it to you now. You talked about the compact. Is this constitutional?
Well, so the challenge is that this National Popular Vote Compact, these state laws, are really an idea so dumb the founders never worried about it or even thought of it, right? The idea that state legislators would pass a law that says we're going to ignore our own people and give away our electoral vote for president is crazy, except that from a certain, standpoint of progressive ideology, for people who draw their power from big urban political machines or would like those political machines to be more powerful in our politics, it's turned out that this national popular vote idea has a lot of salience. Would a court uphold it? I don't think a court should. I think that you can see in the structure of our Constitution and the purpose of the Electoral College that something like national popular vote violates that. But nobody has ever tested that before. And I believe the best thing to do, the safest thing to do, is to stop it in the political branches in the states, which is why Save Our States is focused so much on state legislatures.
So Trent, how many states are on board with national popular vote right now? I mean, and which ones are we talking about?
So 15 states have passed legislation to join the compact, plus the District of Columbia. That gives them 196 electoral votes, although Colorado may get out of the compact this November. The voters are going to have a say on that. But the National Popular Vote Compact has a trigger. So even though all of these states have passed it, it doesn't actually take effect until it's passed by states worth 270 or more electoral votes. In other words, all these states have it on the books, but it has no effect unless they get to an electoral college majority, in which case it would control election outcomes going forward. And these are the usual suspect states: California, Illinois, New York. That's part of why they have so many electoral votes. Yeah. And then you've got Hawaii, New Jersey, Washington, Oregon. States like that. It's been all states controlled by Democrats, kind of with the exception of New York, which has a lot of sort of left-leaning Republicans up there, or did a few years ago. But yeah, it's really the usual suspect states, although they this National Popular Vote campaign spends almost all of their lobbying budget lobbying Republican legislators, and we've had some really close calls in Republican states. So this is a real concern. They have a tremendous amount of money, and they're not going away.
So then, where have you seen victories and success with Save Our State so far?
Yeah, well, so, having worked on this for almost a dozen years, we have been engaged in about 34 or 35 states. We've actually won in most of those states. We won in 25 states, including most recently in Virginia, where, frankly, a lot of my conservative friends said, look, it's a lost cause. Virginia's gone blue. And one of the things that I think we do really well at Save Our States is work with people, whatever side of the aisle they're on, whatever ideology they have, to help them understand why this National Popular Vote plan is dangerous. And we have found some Democrat legislators in Virginia who were willing to stand up against it. In many cases, not for the reasons that I'm against it, but hey, I don't care. We have won so far in Virginia. And I mentioned Colorado. The Democrats won control of Colorado, not just Democrats, but bolder Democrats. If you're from Colorado, that's the kind of the AOC breed of Democrats in that state. They forced this through all party line, and citizens rose up. And we felt very vindicated and excited to see that this really touched a grassroots nerve in Colorado. They signed enough petitions to challenge this through the referendum process there, and voters will vote on it in November. So that's a partial victory. Virginia so far is a complete victory, and I think we're going to have a lot of fights next year.
All right. So how does all this tie into the election integrity issue we've just been talking about?
Yeah, I mean, that's how I got started working on this. I had done some work on constitutional federalism issues, but at the time that all of this came up, I was working at the Freedom Foundation out in Olympia, Washington, and we were working on election integrity there. Some people know what happened in the governor's race in 2004. And this is it's an existential threat to the integrity of presidential elections, and really more than that, to the integrity of elections in general, because if you start mixing ballots across state lines, you will have to have uniform rules. You will have to have one decider for how that system works. It stops being 50 separate state systems and becomes one federal system. And ultimately, we would lose control of elections. In the short term, though, National Popular Vote would create an incentive for vote fraud. Because think about it, right? Right now, all they can do if they're stuffing the ballot box in Los Angeles is steal California, right? But with National Popular Vote, if that took effect, they could stuff the ballot box in Los Angeles and take away my vote in Oklahoma, right? Take away your vote in Virginia or somewhere else. And it's an incentive. It's an added incentive to cheat that I think, if people think through how that would work, it would be a nightmare.
Yeah. Kind of makes your head explode. All right. Trent, thank you for walking us through that. We're going to bring Jason back and Rick, and we're going to get into the Q&A portion of our show. So if you have another question to ask, please put it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. All right, guys. So I'm just going to start with what I think is the $1 million question of the day, because we had at least 6 different people ask this question in different ways. So Jason, we'll start with you, and then we'll hear from Rick and Trent as well. So many questions are coming in wanting specifics. What can the average citizen do right now to safeguard elections? People are asking things like, do we need election officials and poll workers? What does that involve? How can I do that? How can we encourage democratic participation while still restricting fraud? Some other folks are writing letters to the editor and doing things like that. I mean, are those the things? Jason, walk us through it.
Sure. So, right off the bat, I think that this is going to be the most unusual election of our lives. And if you're an administrator trying to make it all work, it's probably going to be the hardest election that you've worked. And so what can the average person do? That's a great question. The first thing that an average person can do is sign up to be a poll worker. A lot of the people who usually work the polls on election day are retirees or older Americans, and they are in the high risk categories, and quite understandably are choosing to sit this one out. And so it's really on us who are younger, have never worked the polls before, to step up and make sure that Americans have voting choices in November and that they will be able to vote in person on election day. We've seen the consequences of not having enough polling places open in primaries, where voters that have to or simply want to vote in person have to stand in lines that can stretch for 6 or 8 hours in some cases. And we don't want people to have to do that again. So yes, you can sign up to be a poll worker. Most states have a central way for you to do that. You typically have to undergo some degree of training, and then many states will compensate folks for either the training or the work that you do at the polling place. But I definitely encourage people to sign up.
And
the
their
other
election
thing else,
commission will steer them in the right place?
yes, so not every state has this, but typically either the Secretary of State or the Elections Board will have a central application process that they'll then route to the individual county or municipal folks who are actually responsible for poll worker recruitment, and then that is at that point you'll be vetted and contacted from there. And you can also find out a little bit more about your state's particular training requirements and other sorts of concerns. The other thing that I'll say in terms of what folks can do, we talked a lot about the polling data that HEP gathered. And, I think that you could fairly say in a lot of these, in a lot of these contexts, 84% support photo ID requirements. 2/3 don't want there to be automatically mailed ballots plus ballot harvesting. I think it'd be fair to say that there is a silent majority of Americans who are being drowned out by about probably 10% of folks, particularly on the left, who are shouting about rules and calling them barriers and trying to strike those down in court or in public. And I think that we need more people to be speaking up and saying that you want an orderly process, a consistent process, a process that is fair and honest and credible, and that is how we encourage people to participate in our democracy. And so the more that people can do to do grassroots organizing, to write op-eds and letters to the editor, and engage with their neighbors and make sure that people understand that this is not voter suppression, that this is trying to defend the legitimacy of our democracy, then I think that the better off we will all be in November and in every election to come.
All right. Rick, anything to add?
Yeah, I would want to reiterate Trent's suggestion that people become poll workers. In Wisconsin in April, the city of Milwaukee is a city of about 600,000 people, had 5 polling places open. Now, I think some of that was intentional incapacity. There were, hardware stores and grocery stores throughout the city of Milwaukee that were wide open in April, and I think they could have done better than have 5. But there are, notoriously, poll workers are older. They may be less likely to want to work. And the process of enforcing social distancing during the pandemic actually requires more poll workers than would normally be the case. And so there is, in fairness, a much larger demand. And I also would reiterate what Trent said about providing support. Those of us who do this work, who take a stance, this is one of the things that I do, and I do a lot of controversial stuff. I filed 2 COVID litigations in the last 2 days. I get more heat from the left on this than I do about anything else. And I think Trent is right. It's a small handful of people who drowned out the less vocal majority. And we need support, those of us who do this. And yes, we like donations and we like money, but we also need just plain old support and in the court of public opinion. And I think that it's important to stand up and be heard.
Thanks, Rick. Trent, anything to add to that, or did they cover it pretty well?
I think they covered it great. I mean, the only thing I would add is it's so important to win hearts and minds, which I think is what Rick was going to there. Anytime you're talking about election fraud, I think the most important thing you can do is have concrete examples, because there are concrete examples of this. Obviously, the New Jersey situation recently, and that helps to push through some of the partisan claims that you hear that this is all just a myth, right? The reality is, whether it happens a lot or a little, it does happen. And the idea that we shouldn't try to prevent it is absurd in the eyes of most people.
All right, thank you. Next question is from our friend Ed Johnson. Ed, thanks for joining the show again. Ed's first question is, how widespread is the voter ID requirement today? Any of you guys have percentages on that?
I think,
Oh, go ahead,
Okay.
Rick.
Go ahead, Rick.
I think about 35 states have some type of identification requirement, but only a minority of those states have a strict photo ID requirement. Some of them require identification that is not a photo ID. And so it's 35 have something, and maybe 10 or less have a strict photo ID requirement.
Do you guys feel like there's traction for more requirements? Jason, your polling sounds like people want that. So what's the problem?
Well, I think that the problem is partisan politics. There has been a pretty consistent and strong push on the left to turn voter ID into really a political wedge issue that is more, I think, about frightening voters into turning out, ironically enough. And so you can sit there and you can show evidence that voter fraud impacts elections and that voter ID laws help to ensure the regular, orderly, fraud-free administration of elections, but you don't make a lot of headway with the activist community. I think actually right now there's a very slight degree of movement in the wrong direction. When Virginia went blue, there was a big push pretty much right away to change election laws, and doing away with the state's voter ID requirement was part of that. So that requirement was substantially watered down. I certainly hope that we can push back, and I think that if we get more people engaged and involved at a grassroots level to win the hearts and minds, as Trent put it, then we can certainly get some additional traction. The other wrinkle I'll add to this is that because we are dealing with the COVID crisis and we're seeing more people voting by absentee, that completely changes the voter ID dynamic, because a lot of these states have different requirements for absentee voting. So in most of these jurisdictions, you move to some combination of a signature matching process or a witness or notary requirement. Very few states actually require that you put a photocopy of a driver's license in your ballot. And that's going to be interesting because there is a lot of litigation right now trying to significantly weaken or outright eliminate those forms of voter identification. And that exposes the process to an unnecessary risk of fraud in November.
Okay. And the last part of this question, do you guys have any specific policies that are in the works, some good examples that are cleaning up voter rolls and minimizing the ballot stuffing problem? Any good stories around that?
Well, there are a few states that have taken the lead on this. I would single out Ohio first and foremost. They put together a process which cleaned the voter rolls up and did it in a way which was in perfect comport with the requirements of federal law and the National Voter Registration Act in particular. And they actually had to fight all the way to the United States Supreme Court in order to win the right to clean up their voter rolls, because they had a liberal activist group suing to stop that. And that's been a process that we've seen repeated in just about any state that has taken the proactive steps necessary to actually clean up their voter rolls. So I would say that Ohio is a clear example of a successful state doing that. Georgia has also done a very good job, and they have been very proactive at cleaning up their voter rolls. There are clear examples like that, but of course the retort is that they're just engaging in voter suppression. And I'm sure that Rick would have a thing or two to say about that, but I'll simply say that, look, I mean, you use the data, you have a delay in the process, you reach out to voters to try to make sure that they have indeed left or moved away. And I would bet in most, if not nearly all of these cases, the voters whose rights are supposedly being squashed by this process are happily voting someplace else, or they are deceased or disqualified from voting. And if we don't, recognize that 10% of the American population moves every year, and we don't want these outdated records to linger on the rolls, then we will, run into problems where the voter rolls are simply inaccurate and unreliable. And there's broad support there too for cleaning up those voter rolls.
All right, so Nick Gillum and Jason Faubert asked a similar question along those lines, but the question is, what can we do to prevent massive ballot harvesting, like what occurred in California in the 2018 congressional races? Also of note, it looks like there's a DNR printed on the exterior of the mail-in ballot envelope. Doesn't that just make it convenient for any devious soul handling these envelopes to throw away the party that they oppose? So give us some good practices that are coming out of some of this scandal.
Well, I'll pass it over to the election security guys, but I think the D and the R has to do with primary ballots going out to voters. That's not something that you should find in a general election.
Hopefully.
Because voters, in the primary, Democrats get a different ballot than Republicans do.
Okay. Rick, anything to add?
Yeah, look, we face this curious ideology from the left that says that voting is the most sacred right that we have, but that nobody can be expected to do anything to comply with reasonable requirements to make sure that elections are regular and the results are secure. And so anything that we do invites litigation. And it will be important, I think, for us to continue to recognize this. And I think Trent's polling found that voters understand that voting rights are really on both sides of the equation here. That yes, it's important that we make voting as easy as we possibly can, but it's also important that we make voting as secure and honest and not susceptible to fraud as we can, because each of those things supports the right to vote. If my vote is canceled because somebody has cast an improper ballot, or someone has harvested my vote and failed to return it to the election official, I have been disenfranchised in a very, very real way. And I think we have to emphasize this. We have to be more than simply defensive. We are not simply preventing fraud, but by preventing fraud, we are defending the franchise and the right of every American to vote.
All right, thank you. Okay, we've got time for one more question. There are more questions that have been submitted, and I apologize we can't get to all of them, but we will make sure that we have someone contact you if you ask a question that's not answered, and we'll continue the conversation a little later after the show. Last question, and this is a little bit of a loaded one, so everybody brace yourselves. It's from Nisi Hamilton. Nisi, thanks for asking. Listen, we've talked about how this issue gets so politicized. Given that we all understand that, are the president's tweets on mail-in voting helping or hurting the cause? Who wants to answer that one? I'll start with you, Rick. You look like you've got something to say.
I'll say it. I think it doesn't help the cause. We are not going to have a mail-in election. It's not going to happen. But we are going to have a lot of people who cast their vote by mail. And so it's really important for us to emphasize making that process fair. Because I don't think that most Americans think that absentee balloting is intrinsically wrong. But I think they understand the argument that we need to have appropriate safeguards. And so I'm sorry, but I just don't think it's helping. And I really do wish that he would stop.
Trent and Jason, do you guys agree?
I'll say that I think it's best that we not get distracted by these sorts of things, because it's so easy at that point to get pulled into a minefield, and then it does drop down into the partisan politicking. And I would rather keep this conversation focused, as Rick indicated, on the very basic common sense need to secure our elections. We know that fraud occurs. We know that it can swing the outcome of elections. We know that absentee balloting is particularly vulnerable to fraud. And so we need to have safeguards in place, like ballot harvesting bans and voter identification requirements, to make sure that that process is as secure as we can make it. And so I think that we need to be focused on that sort of messaging. And I think that's what will resonate with voters. And the president's free to tweet whatever he chooses. But we have I think a very, very strong message that resonates with people, and is a winning message, really, when you get down to it.
Trent, you get the final word.
Okay, well, I think what the president's tweets show is the limits of setting policy in a federal republic from Washington, D.C., right? The problem with the president's tweets is that, there are some states where we can resist this push to vote by mail. There are other states that already do this. They've been doing it for a long time. I mentioned Washington State, where I grew up. They've had real problems with this, but a lot of people have become accustomed to it. And, dare I say it, despite the great efforts of the Freedom Foundation and people like Bob Williams and Lynn Harsh, Washington State went to all vote by mail. And that fight is over there at this point. And so I think it ought to remind us the importance of the kind of work that the groups on this call do and that State Policy Network does. We're out in the states. That's where the policy is set on elections primarily. That's where we need to be engaged. Every state is different. And so the work that Jason does, the work that Rick does, the work that we're doing at Save Our States, we are tailored to the places where we're fighting this fight. And that is what we have to do if we are going to effectively engage in election policy work to protect the integrity of the ballot box for Americans.
Thanks, Trent. And thank you for everyone who joined us today. The three of you guys have been working on this, not just in the last few months because we have a shiny election coming up, but you guys do this work day in and day out and will continue to after the 2020 election. And the fight is in the states, Trent. Thank you for reminding us of that. Thank you to everybody who joined us today and for all of you speakers. Just to recap, what we want to do here is make it easy to vote and hard to cheat. So write your letters to the editor, give the moral support and financial support that Rick was talking about. Sign up to be a poll worker and help make sure that your polls stay open. And anything you can do when you talk with your friends to make this less of a political issue and more of a very simple, easy to vote, hard to cheat kind of conversation, please get out there and help us do it. Thank you so much for joining today. I hope you're back. Our next show is going to be September 16th, where we're going to feature the Bob Williams Award winners from our annual meeting, which is next week. So come on and see some of the awards that the folks in our network are getting for their outstanding work that you have made possible. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for the great conversation, those of you who are our speakers today, and hope to see you on the 16th. Bye.